Welcome to the Excellence in Church Administration podcast, informing, encouraging, and supporting your church. Your hosts are Michael Martin and Dan Busby from ECFA.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. This is Michael Martin from ECFA with another round of the Excellence in Church Administration podcast. And we're actually here in part 2 of a 2-part series on tax and reporting made easy, based on our 2 latest tax guides, Ministers' Taxes Made Easy and Church Reporting Made Easy. And I'm really privileged to be here again with 2 of my friends and co-authors of these guides, Vonna Lau and Dan Busby. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Michael.
Good to be with you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Our colleague John Van Drunen as well is also a major contributor to these helpful resources for churches. And we'll talk more about how to access those free resources later in the podcast. But first, just a reminder and encouragement, if you did miss part 1 in the series on 5 tax-saving tips for pastors, you'll definitely want to check out that episode as well. We talked there about some easy ways for pastors to leverage the tax law to save money, and also some special considerations in light of the new tax reform law that was just signed into law, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So that brings us to, for this podcast, we're picking up right where we left off with 3 refreshers on church reporting. And as we sit down to record this podcast, it's early on in the new year, which we know is a busy administrative time for churches, with everything from reporting to donors on gifts made in the prior year, reporting on compensation paid to employees and independent contractors, as well as other forms of information reporting. So today we are going to highlight a few of those areas and reference the Church Reporting Made Easy ebook that are all designed to help save you time and hopefully a little frustration in the busyness of this season. So without further ado, we're going to get started here, Vonna, with you. I know that one of the reporting areas that's on everyone's minds this time of year is charitable gift reporting to donors. What reminders and tips do you have for us as we get started with refresher number 1?
Well, thanks, Michael. I would start by saying there are very few requirements regarding charitable gift reporting that have a direct impact on the church. Some of the other reporting requirements we're going to talk about in this podcast have penalties or other consequences. There are some things, the church may need to complete a Form 8282 or a 1098C for non-cash gifts, but the primary focus in this area is related to cash gifts. And I would just remind listeners, when we talk about cash gifts, we're not just talking about cash, not, the $5 bill in your pocket. We're talking about checks, credit card, direct deposits, all of the ways that cash directly hits the church's bank account. And this type of reporting is important mostly for the donor, and we don't want to mess that up. So I would say my first tip is this matters. We often hear of donors losing tax deductions, sometimes even tens of thousands of dollars, and you don't want that to be your church. You don't want that to be your donor. So let me give you just a few key reminders. Let's start with timing. Receipts need to be given to donors before their tax returns are due or filed, whichever is earlier. And some donors really like to get their tax returns done early. Maybe they do extra withholding, and so as soon as they've got their W-2s, they want that money back. And so you don't have till April 15th to make sure it's in hand for them. So a lot of churches try to get them out by January 31st, and I would say, definitely get them out the sooner the better. Next, make sure that you include the necessary information on those gift acknowledgments. Include the church's name, the date the donation was made, put a date on the acknowledgement so they know when that was issued, the amount of cash contributed, and then whether any goods or services were received in exchange for that. That's a key piece of information to remember. Non-cash gift acknowledgments, just briefly, I would note, make sure that those include a description of the item, but not of value. And then keep in mind that if a donor gives a single cash gift of $250 or more, they need to have an acknowledgement. So You have, the ability to do that a number of different ways. You might give it after each gift or at any interval. Some churches do annual statements. Some do quarterly reporting. There isn't a specific expectation there, but consider what the best way will be both for the church as well as for the donor to make sure that they're covered. And then, Michael, I would just remind listeners that this was a brief overview, very brief,
Very brief,
overview
but good.
of charitable reporting. But we do have a webinar available on acknowledging and reporting contributions for churches and ministries that goes much further in depth.
Yeah, that's right. That's actually one of our most popular webinars every year. So appreciate that reference and a really good overview as we talk about gift reporting, which is refresher number 1. Turning to you, Dan, we also alluded, I know, earlier in the podcast to certain reporting responsibilities that churches have with respect to compensation that's paid to their employees. So what can you tell us about that? Are there any common mistakes that you've seen over the years?
Well, Michael, there are a number of common mistakes. I'll just highlight the top 4 in my memory. Number 1, the failure to report taxable fringe benefits and Social Security reimbursements as taxable compensation on the Form W-2. Number 2, reporting Social Security and Medicare wages and withholding in boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6 of the Form W-2 for pastors. Number 3, failure to report non-cash compensation as taxable compensation on Form W-2. And finally, number 4, including a designated housing allowance as taxable compensation in Box 1 of the Form 1040. Let me just roll back through those real quickly. So, number 1, failure to report taxable fringe benefits and Social Security reimbursements as taxable compensation on Form W-2. Let me just leave a couple examples. First, let's say a church wants to assist its pastor in building up his or her retirement fund. However, instead of paying money into a 403B plan on a salary reduction basis, the church simply adds $500 each month to the pastor's paycheck and marks it retirement contribution. The church doesn't add the $500 a month to the year-end Form W-2 in Box 1 as taxable compensation, and so the pastor underreports $6,000 of income. Or let's say the church gives the pastor an $800 a month auto allowance. The pastor does not keep a daily mileage log upon which to document the miles, and the church does not report the $800 a month on the year-end Form W-2 in Box 1, and so we have $800 times 12, $9,600 of underreported income. Or number 2, reporting Social Security and Medicare wages and withholding in boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6 of Form W-2 for a pastor. The key principle is that ministers are always subject to ECFA-type Social Security and never subject to FICA, and ECFA is calculated on Schedule SE. So if a church includes data in boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6 of Form W-2, it's a dead giveaway that they have applied the incorrect type of Social Security for the pastor. You might say, well, what's the big deal? The government's going to get 15.3% either way. Well, it's a big deal because if a church applies FICA to a pastor's pay, they are paying half, 7.65, of the FICA as a tax-free fringe benefit to the pastor when, of course, it's fully taxable. Or number 3, the failure to report non-cash compensation as taxable compensation on Form W-2. Let's say that during the year, gift cards are given by the church to the pastor. These could be gift cards the church has purchased and gifted to the pastor, or simply gift cards that someone has gifted to the church, and the gift cards are in the church's gift card inventory. We probably should talk about that in terms of internal controls, but that's for another day.
Another podcast.
Another podcast. Either way, when the church gives the pastor a gift card, it's considered taxable compensation in exchange for services rendered. And then finally, number 4, including a designated housing allowance as taxable compensation on Form W-2. If the church does include the designated housing allowance in Box 1, that is undoubtedly going to cause the pastor pain because the tax preparer has to deal with that information in Box 1 that is typically fully taxable for Social Security purposes, but the housing allowance is tax-free for income tax purposes. So year end, is a chance to clean up compensation reporting issues before the W-2s are filed. If we don't catch the problems at year end before the W-2s are filed, then we're in amended W-2 category that we like to call W-2Cs. Those are doable, but more painful. So there you go. Well, Michael, that just about covers the employer reporting refreshers. Can you wrap it up with the final refreshers on other forms of information reporting?
I'll be happy to do so. I guess what you're saying is I'm batting cleanup.
Yes, you are.
Right? All right. Well, no, that's very good. And we do actually give a lot of coverage in the ebook to these final categories as well. So in addition to what Vonna covered in terms of charitable gift reporting, and then Dan with the employer reporting in the final section of the ebook, we talk about other general forms of information reporting responsibilities for churches. So here are just a few bullet point reminders here. The first would be, don't forget that information forms, we're talking about the 1098 and the 1099, these must be provided to the payers and recipients on or before January 31, following the calendar year that the funds were paid or received. So a common example here you're probably thinking of would be any of the church's independent contractors. We know that reporting for occasional workers especially can be easy to overlook sometimes, so just a refresher there. Some churches may also have reporting responsibilities for non-resident aliens, maybe payments of interest or payments of royalties and for other services. Also very common, every church in America probably has at least one volunteer. So payments to or on behalf of volunteers that are not business expenses are reported on Form W-2 or Form 1099 MISC, depending on whether or not a common law employee relationship exists. That's a common question that we get. We talk about more about that in the ebook if it's ever appropriate to make those kinds of reports. And the last area that I'll touch on briefly in the category of other information reporting is unrelated business income. Important for churches to pay attention to. Many of you, this will probably be a review, but churches are generally responsible for paying taxes and reporting on what's called the Form 990T, any income from activities that are not directly related to fulfilling the church's tax-exempt purposes. And again, we refer to that as unrelated business income. So again, that's a ton of information to take in, and we'll go ahead and stop there for now with these refreshers on church reporting, because I know for many of you, you're probably listening to this podcast, maybe you're on the go or you're busy with other things that are going on in the office. And so in the church reporting ebook, I think one of the most helpful tools that we provide is a one-page summary. Don't you love the one-page summaries of payment reporting requirements? And so we've talked a lot about this ebook already throughout the podcast. So let's take a quick break to hear from Tracy on our church engagement team about how to access this resource on church reporting made easy.
Well, hey, this is great information, Michael, and I'm so glad that we have a companion ebook available as well. Church Reporting Made Easy will help increase your confidence by understanding the procedures and reporting responsibilities with simplified explanations and sample documents. Because as we've discussed on the podcast, churches, like other employers, have numerous tax and other reporting obligations. This ebook, along with many other free resources, is available by getting connected to the Church Excel community at churchexcel.org and clicking on Electronic Tax Guides from your Church Excel dashboard. Or if you're an ECFA member, go to the resources page at ecfa.church. For more detailed tax and financial information for churches, our 2018 Zondervan Church and Nonprofit Tax and Financial Guide is easy to understand, filled with the latest tax law changes and expert advice on handling charitable gifts and more. All ECFA member ministries are receiving a free copy in early 2018. It can also be ordered from the resources page on ecfa.church. Michael, let's finish out the podcast with some more great helps for our church friends.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Tracy. We're definitely really pleased to offer the Church Reporting Made Easy ebook and so many other great free resources for churches at churchexcel.org. We're also privileged to see the number of ECFA church members growing today at a record pace. Churches that have been certified by ECFA can display ECFA's seal of financial integrity before their givers and access all of the great resources that we offer here at ECFA. Just want to take a minute here also to mention that we've made some major changes here recently to the certification process that are designed to save you time and money while also upholding the same high ECFA standards. So if you have any questions about certification or other ECFA resources, what it means to be a member, just email us at podcast@ecfa.org and we'll be happy to help with that. And so one final note here, while we're on the topic of taxes, we did mention earlier in passing the major tax reform law that was just approved in Congress with many of the provisions that are going into effect actually starting in January 1, 2018. So if you're looking to catch up on what's happened and what are the most significant changes that are impacting churches and their leaders, it's as easy as just visiting ecfa.church/events to access the free webinar. And finally, in wrapping up the podcast, just want to take a moment here to ask Dan, can you share a few words of encouragement with us that are related to today's topic, really along the lines of, I know in this area we talked a lot about just stewardship in terms of people and also givers. Any kind of inspiration or encouraging words that you can share with us?
Well, Michael, one of my favorite verses is Titus 2, 7, and 8. In your teaching, show integrity, seriousness, and soundness of speech that cannot be condemned, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about you. And so when we show integrity, seriousness, and soundness of speech that cannot be condemned, we set a pattern for stewardship. Because when there's nothing to say bad about us or bad to say about our work, we have stewarded our resources, enabling us to invest our time in the ultimate service for the King.
That's great, Dan. And so fitting, too, with just the title of this podcast as well, being excellence in church administration. So thanks so much for those words and for joining us again. And thank you, Vana, as well, for your great thoughts and the tips that you shared today on church reporting. And also, of course, thank you to everyone, again, for tuning in and for all that you do to glorify God in your churches through excellence in church administration. We appreciate each and every one of you, and we look forward to being with you again soon on another episode of the Excellence in Church Administration podcast.